In the spring of 1868, a Union Pacific survey crew moved along a barren stretch of Wyoming territory northwest of the Medicine Bow River, testing the ground the way railroad men had learned to test it that decade, with a pick, a boot heel, and a nose for anything that burned. Grenville Dodge, the railroad's chief engineer, had already staked more miles of track across the plains than almost any man alive, and he understood before most that the line he was building would live or die on one resource the locomotives could not do without: coal. He had spent the 2 years before that spring picking a route around the worst grades of southern Wyoming, trading grazing rights and town site promises to keep his crews moving, and by the time they reached the Medicine Bow country, he had learned to read a landscape the way other men read a ledger, for what it would cost him and what it would give back. What the crew found that spring, exposed in a low outcrop where a dry wash had cut through the topsoil, was a black seam roughly 4 feet thick, dense and faintly glassy, where wind and rain had polished its face. The kind of steam coal a locomotive could burn without much preparation, thick enough to work by hand within days. Within a year, a town stood over it. The town took its name from the mineral itself, and the county that would eventually surround it took the same name, Carbon, so that the coal and the place became, on every map printed afterward, the same word twice. What no map printed afterward would ever fully record was what happened underneath it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Carbon was never a large town by the standards of the era, home to a few thousand people at its peak, but what it lacked in population it made up for in the amount of ground removed from beneath it. The mine that fed it worked the seam by the room and pillar method standard to 19th century American coal work, tunnels driven in a rough grid 6 to 8 feet high, coal hauled out on mule cars, square pillars of untouched coal left standing every few yards to hold up the rock overhead. Timbering followed whatever pattern the shift foreman on duty that week preferred, since no uniform engineering code governed it, and ventilation in the earliest years relied on nothing more sophisticated than a furnace shaft cut at the far end of the workings, drawing bad air out by heat and pressure rather than by any mechanical fan. Pillars were left roughly 15 to 20 feet, on a side by rule of thumb rather than by calculation, a foreman's guess at how much coal could stay in the ground without the roof coming down, a guess that varied from crew to crew and from year to year. On the surface, the town nearly mirrored the tunnels beneath it, a grid of frame houses hauled in by rail car, a company store, a schoolhouse, 2 churches for a population divided by faith as much as by shift schedule, mule stables set close to the main shaft mouth, and a cemetery set on a low rise slightly apart from the rest, the one structure at Carbon still visited with any regularity today. Multiple operators worked the seam over more than 3 decades, first small contractors under short-term lease, later the Union Pacific Coal Company directly, and each new lease brought a new set of foremen with their own habits and their own sense of where the old workings ended. Each new operator drove new headings, some following the old workings, some cutting past them at odd angles on the assumption that the earlier company's tunnels had already played out, some abandoning shafts halfway through when the coal pinched out or the roof proved unstable. Nobody kept one continuous, unified map of all of it. Territorial Wyoming's mine inspection law, passed in 1869, among the earliest of its kind west of the Mississippi, required inspectors to check for gas accumulation and roof stability. It did not require any operator to file a single master survey with the county, and even where individual companies drew their own internal maps for their own use, those maps traveled with the company's office, not with the ground they described. For more than 30 years that arrangement held, imperfect but functional, because the town needed the mine and the railroad needed the town, and nobody had reason to ask what the tunnels actually looked like from above until the reason the town existed disappeared. In 1900, Union Pacific surveyors identified a shorter, gentler route across the same stretch of Wyoming, one that avoided the steep grade its trains had struggled with at Carbon since the line first opened. The railroad built a new town roughly 20 miles to the southeast to serve the new route and named it Hanna, and by 1902 the main line no longer touched carbon at all. A coal town with no railroad running through it had no reason to exist. Miners left for Hanna by the hundreds, and what could be moved was moved with them. Surviving company records from the period, thin as they are, describe frame buildings loaded whole onto flat cars and hauled to the new town rather than left standing, doors and window sashes and roof timbers stripped from what could not be moved and reused elsewhere along the line. Within a handful of years, the population that had briefly touched several thousand had fallen to almost nothing, and by the 1920s carbon existed only as building foundations, cellar depressions cut into the prairie grass, and a cemetery slowly losing its fence line to the wind. What the mine itself became, once the last operator walked away, is a harder question than what happened to the town, because nobody was paid to answer it. Wyoming's State Mine Inspector's Office, expanded after statehood in 1890, tracked active operations, output tonnage, and reported accidents, the kind of information state government needed to justify its own budget line. Inspectors rode a circuit that covered every working mine in the southern half of the territory, and later the state, and their reports, where they survive, read as brisk, practical documents, tonnage figures, gas readings, a line or two on ventilation, rarely more than a page for an operation the size of Carbon's. It did not track abandoned workings once a company stopped filing reports, because an idle mine was, on paper, no longer anyone's responsibility. The Union Pacific Coal Company's own internal maps for the carbon field, where they survive at all, are held today in scattered university and railroad archive collections rather than as one continuous set, and researchers who have gone looking for a single document that reconciles every tunnel driven under carbon between 1868 and 1902 have not found one, because no single map was ever made to reconcile. What exists instead is a patchwork, one company's survey overlapping the edge of another's by an uncertain margin, dates that do not line up, tunnel headings that stop cold on one sheet and simply do not appear on the next. Where individual pages survive, they are drawn in the plain surveying hand of the period, ink lines on linen or heavy paper, a compass rose in one corner and a scale bar in another, a working man's document meant to guide the next week's digging rather than to stand as a permanent record. None of them carry a county filing stamp, because none of them were ever required to. Carbon County's own modern land records, built from 20th century surface surveys, show property lines, mineral rights, and grazing leases with real precision. They show almost nothing about what lies beneath those lines, because the county was never given the information to show it, and Wyoming's abandoned mine land program, the state office now responsible for old coal workings across the southern half of the state, has said plainly in its own public reporting that a meaningful share of the mines on its list are undocumented beyond an approximate surface location. Carbon is one of them. The absence shows up on the ground itself. Ranchers who have run cattle across the old town site for generations have learned to watch for sudden depressions after a wet spring, places where the earth settles overnight into a shallow bowl with no visible cause, and more than one has reported a fence post or a truck tire dropping a foot or more into ground that looked solid the day before. A depression like that rarely announces itself in advance. The grass on top keeps growing right up until the roof timber beneath it finally gives way, and what looks from a truck window like ordinary open range can be, underneath, a hollow space with nothing supporting it but a handful of coal pillars, a shift foreman sized by eye more than a century ago. None of these events has ever been formally tied to a specific documented tunnel, because there is no complete document to tie it to. The land moves according to a map nobody currently holds, following headings cut by men whose names, in most cases, were never recorded anywhere but a payroll ledger that has not survived. This pattern repeats wherever 19th century Wyoming coal was worked hard for a few decades and then abandoned, and it did not stay confined to one small town that outlived its usefulness to a railroad. The town that replaced Carbon inherited more than its miners. It inherited the same rushed, poorly reconciled approach to underground surveying, and the results were severe within its first decade. On June 30, 1903, An explosion tore through Union Pacific Coal Company Mine No. 1 at Hanna, killing 169 men in what remains one of the deadliest coal mining disasters in American history. Investigators at the time pointed to gas accumulation in sealed-off sections of the mine, sections whose exact extent, even to the company officials directing the rescue, was not fully certain from the surface maps available to them. 5 years later, on March 28, 1908, a second explosion at the same mine killed 59 more, several of them among the rescue crews sent back in after the first blast to recover bodies from workings whose full layout nobody on the surface could confirm with confidence. Both disasters happened in a mine built by the same company, using the same surveying habits, that had already walked away from an entire town less than 30 miles up the line without leaving behind a usable map of what it had dug there. Hanna buried so many men in 1903 that the town needed a second cemetery within the year, and after the second explosion in 1908, several families who had already lost one relative to the first blast lost another to the second, a repetition grim enough that surviving local accounts describe entire households leaving Hanna for good, rather than wait to see whether the mine would take a third turn at the same ground. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything, and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. That habit has never fully corrected itself, and the clearest proof of that sits beneath a city that never disappeared at all. Carbon and Hanna both prove the same point from the position of towns the industry eventually abandoned or nearly destroyed outright. What happens when the industry instead stays for good, growing a real city on top of the same unreconciled habits, is a separate experiment, and Wyoming ran it less than 100 miles further along the same rail corridor Dodge's crews first surveyed. Rock Springs, incorporated the same decade Carbon was already an old town, grew into one of Wyoming's largest cities by drawing immigrant labor from more than 30 different countries to work coal seams even more extensive than the ones under Carbon and Hanna combined. Unlike Carbon, Rock Springs never lost its railroad, and it never emptied out. It kept building on top of itself for more than a century, and it is precisely because the city stayed inhabited that its tunnel problem became impossible to ignore rather than easy to forget. City crews laying water and sewer lines through the 20th century learned to expect the unexpected, tunnels appearing where no permit or survey said a tunnel should exist, some still shored with rotting 19th century timber, some collapsed decades earlier, and simply forgotten by anyone still living to remember digging them. Long-time residents describe a particular local unease that comes with owning a house downtown, a habit of noticing a new crack in a foundation or a low spot in a backyard, and wondering, half joking and half not, whether it means anything or whether it is simply the ground settling the way ground settles everywhere. In a city built on a known coal field, that joke carries a different weight than it would somewhere else. Rock Springs sits above what city and state officials now describe, in their own public materials, as one of the largest concentrations of undocumented underground coal workings in the American West. A tangle of rooms and pillars driven by dozens of competing operators between the 1860s and the 1940s, few of whom coordinated with each other and fewer still of whom filed maps that survive intact. The city has spent decades and public money backfilling shafts, discovered only after a sinkhole opened beneath a street, a parking lot, or more than once a building foundation, and more than one downtown block has been closed on short notice while crews located and filled a void that gave no warning before it appeared. Wyoming's abandoned mineland program lists dozens of confirmed subsidence sites in and around Rock Springs, each one a place where the ground gave way, in a location the official county record shows as solid, undisturbed earth. The pattern connecting Rock Springs to Carbon is not speculation about what might be underground. It is the same institutional habit, repeated at a larger scale and over a longer stretch of time. Coal removed quickly by whichever operator held the lease that decade. Safety inspected only while a mine stayed active. Ownership and paperwork changing hands faster than any surveyor could keep pace with. And no single authority ever assigned the job of reconciling what different operators had done to the same ground over the better part of 80 years. Carbon disappeared before anyone thought to ask that question properly. Rock Springs stayed inhabited long enough for the ground itself to keep asking it, one closed street at a time, for more than a century. What this means for carbon, sitting empty under the Wyoming grass roughly 40 miles from the interstate that eventually replaced the railroad that built it, is that no official document currently in Carbon County's possession can tell a landowner, a rancher, or a curious visitor with any certainty where the ground beneath their boots was once hollowed out and where it never was touched at all. The county's own geographic information system, built from modern aerial and property survey data, shows Carbon as a site of historic interest, with a handful of platted lots and a marked cemetery boundary. It shows no tunnel headings, because it has none on file to show. What survives instead is scattered across a handful of archive boxes at the University of Wyoming and inside Union Pacific's own corporate records, none of it complete, none of it reconciled against the rest, and none of it checked against the actual ground, since the last mine closed more than a century ago. Between those fragments and the grass now covering Carbon lies exactly the gap the state's own abandoned mine records openly admit to. A town whose surface history is thoroughly documented and whose underground history is not, and may never be again, since the men who dug it left no unified record and are no longer alive to draw one from memory. Grenville Dodge, the engineer who first put a survey stake in that outcrop of coal in 1868, spent the remainder of his long career building railroads across the continent and never returned to the town his crew's discovery had created. He could not have known that the ground his surveyors marked with such confidence that spring would end up, a century and a half later, better known for what could not be surveyed than for what could. The stake his crew drove into that outcrop was, in its own way, the most accurate document the site would ever produce. It marked a single point with total confidence and said nothing at all about what lay beneath it, which turned out to be true of nearly every record that followed for the next century and a half. The seam is still there, somewhere under the grass and the cellar depressions and the leaning cemetery fence, and so are the tunnels that followed it, however many of them there finally turned out to be. Visitors who drive the gravel road out to the town site today find a historical marker, a scattering of foundation stones low enough to miss if the light is wrong, and a fence line around the graves that volunteers still repair by hand every few years. Nothing on that marker mentions what runs beneath the field around it, because nobody who could write that part of the sign has ever known enough to write it accurately. The pillars, wherever they still stand, are still holding up whatever rock and soil was left above them to hold. And Carbon County, built on a name meant to honor exactly what was found in that outcrop, still cannot draw one accurate map of where the digging actually went. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.